The kitchen window was fogged with steam from the roast beef I'd been tending for 3 hours. 80 candles sat ready on the dining room table, and I'd polished every piece of silver until it gleamed. My arthritis screamed with each movement, but I wanted everything perfect for my 80th birthday dinner. After all, how many chances do you get to celebrate 8 decades with the people you love most? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was adjusting the centerpiece when I heard Michael's voice drift from the study, followed by Patty's hushed whisper. Something about the house and sooner than expected. My hearing might not be what it used to be, but those words stopped me cold. I crept closer to the partially open door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Look, Mom's not going to live forever, Michael was saying, his tone casual as if he were discussing the weather. We need to be realistic about the timeline here. Patty's voice was sharp with excitement. The funeral home director said if we book now, we can lock in today's prices. Inflation is hitting everything, even caskets. My hand flew to my mouth. They were planning my funeral at my birthday party, while I was still very much alive and cooking their dinner in the next room. Ashley's voice joined in, bright and eager. Grandma's house would be perfect for Tyler and me. We could convert the basement into a rental unit and actually make money off this place. Tyler laughed. I'm already looking at cars. That vintage Buick of hers has got to be worth something, and her jewelry collection is insane. My legs nearly gave out. These children I'd helped raise, whose college tuitions I'd paid, whose wedding I'd funded, were discussing my belongings like items at an estate sale. And I wasn't even dead yet. The truth is, I should have seen this coming. For the past 40 years, I'd been the foundation everyone else built their lives on, never questioning whether that foundation might be crumbling under the weight of their expectations. It started innocently enough after my husband Frank passed away 15 years ago. Michael, my only child, had just gotten married to Patty, and they were struggling to make ends meet. The hardware store Frank and I had built from nothing was doing well, but Michael had big dreams and bigger expenses. When he asked to borrow against my share of the business, I didn't hesitate. Family comes first, right? That first loan became a second, then a third. Before I knew it, Michael was managing not just his portion of the business, but mine as well. It's easier this way, Mom, he'd assured me. You don't need to worry about the boring financial stuff. Just enjoy retirement. Retirement. That was a joke. While Michael managed my business interests, I was managing everything else. When Ashley graduated college and couldn't find work, guess who let her move back home? When Tyler got arrested for that DUI, guess who paid the lawyer? Fees. When Patty's mother needed surgery, guess who covered the medical bills their insurance wouldn't touch? Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering happened at my house. I cooked, I cleaned, I hosted, and I paid. Always with a smile, because that's what mothers do, right? We give until there's nothing left to give, and then we find something else to offer. The Victorian house on Maple Street had been Frank's and my dream home. We'd bought it as newlyweds, spending weekends stripping wallpaper and refinishing hardwood floors. Every room held memories of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and quiet Sunday dinners. The mortgage had been paid off for 20 years, but somehow I still felt like I was drowning in debt. Emotional debt, the kind that accumulates when you spend decades being the bank, the hotel, and the safety net for everyone you love. Michael had his own house across town, a lovely colonial that I'd helped him buy with a down payment gift of $50,000. But family dinners were always at Grandma's house. Family celebrations were always at Grandma's house. Even casual visits somehow turned into me cooking elaborate meals while everyone else relaxed in the living room, discussing their problems and expecting me to provide solutions. I told myself this was normal. This was love. This was what family looked like. But standing there in my hallway, listening to my son calculate my remaining lifespan like a depreciating asset, I realized I'd been confusing love with utility. I wasn't the beloved matriarch of this family. I was the resource they were all waiting to inherit. The dining room had never looked more beautiful. I'd used my grandmother's china, the set I'd been saving for special occasions for the past 30 years. Fresh flowers from my garden created a centerpiece that would have made Martha Stewart proud. The chandelier cast warm light over the table. Set for 5, each place setting perfectly arranged with the silver Frank had bought me for our 25th anniversary. Michael arrived first, as he always did, claiming his spot at the head of the table like he already owned the place. He was a handsome man, I'll give him that, with Frank's strong jaw and my blue eyes. But where Frank had possessed a gentle strength, Michael carried himself with an entitlement that I'd somehow failed to notice until tonight. Patty swept in behind him, her blonde hair perfectly styled and her outfit clearly expensive. She'd never worked a day since marrying Michael, but somehow always had the latest handbag and the newest iPhone. I'd stopped questioning where the money came from because I was afraid I already knew the answer. Ashley and Tyler arrived together, as they often did these days. Ashley had been living in my guest room for 3 years now, supposedly saving money for her own place. Tyler still lived with his parents, but spent most of his free time at my house, eating my food and using my Wi-Fi while playing video games in the basement. As we gathered around the table, I forced my brightest smile and tried to push the overheard conversation from my mind. Maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe they were planning something else entirely. Maybe my family wasn't actually sitting around my birthday table calculating my death benefits. "Happy birthday, Grandma," Ashley exclaimed, handing me a card that looked suspiciously like it had been picked up from the grocery store checkout line. Inside was a generic message about aging. Gracefully and a gift card to Target for $25. Tyler's gift was even more thoughtful. A box of chocolate-covered cherries from the drugstore, still bearing the clearance sticker from last Valentine's Day. Michael and Patty presented me with a potted plant, the kind of generic arrangement that screamed last-minute panic purchase. I thanked them all warmly, because that's what I did. I expressed gratitude for the bare minimum while I sat surrounded by the elaborate feast I'd spent days preparing. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd given myself a better birthday gift than anyone else at this table. As we ate, the conversation flowed around me like I was a piece of furniture. Michael discussed work problems. Patty complained about her book club. Ashley lamented her job search. And Tyler described his latest gaming achievements. Nobody asked about my week, my health, or my plans. I was the host, the cook, and the audience. But I wasn't really a participant. After dinner, I began clearing plates while everyone else moved to the living room. This was the routine we'd established over the years. I cleaned up while they digested and socialized. When I finally joined, them coffee and dessert served on yet another family heirloom. The conversation had moved to vacation plans. "Patty and I are thinking about that cruise to Alaska," Michael was saying. "The one we saw advertised. It's pricey, but we deserve a real vacation." "You should totally do it," Ashley chimed in. "Life's too short to skip the good stuff." Tyler nodded enthusiastically. "Plus, Grandma always says family adventures are the best investment." I had said that many times, usually while writing checks to fund those family adventures. But as I looked around the room at their expectant faces, I realized they weren't including me in this particular adventure. The cruise was for Michael and Patty. The family adventures were for everyone except the person funding them. That's when it hit me with devastating clarity. I wasn't family to them. I was the family foundation, the source of funds and stability that everyone else built their lives upon. I was expected to provide, to support, to enable, but never to participate. I was the bank, the hotel, and the safety net, but I wasn't actually a person with my own dreams and desires. The birthday cake I'd baked myself sat untouched on the coffee table, 80 candles melted down to colorful puddles of wax. I'd made my own birthday cake. I'd planned my own party. I'd cooked my own celebration dinner. And in a few hours, I'd clean up the mess while everyone else went home to their own lives, probably discussing what a nice evening they'd had at poor old Grandma's house. As the evening wound down and my family prepared to leave, each offering perfunctory hugs and promises to call soon, I stood in my doorway watching their taillights disappear down Maple Street. The house felt enormous and empty, filled with the echoes of laughter that had never really included me. I walked through, the rooms turning off lights and straightening cushions, surrounded by decades of memories that suddenly felt hollow. Every family photo on the mantel showed the same pattern. Me in the background, serving or hosting or organizing, while everyone else enjoyed the moment I'd created for them. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed Frank and I had shared for 37 years, staring at my reflection in the antique mirror we'd found at a flea market during our honeymoon. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, worn down by decades of giving without receiving, of loving without being valued. I'd spent 80 years building a life, only to discover that the people I'd built it for were already dividing up, the pieces. I wasn't a beloved mother and grandmother. I was an inheritance waiting to happen. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to wait for them to plan my funeral. I was going to plan my life instead. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And if my family thought I was going to quietly fade away while they positioned themselves to benefit from my death, they were about to discover just how much fight this 80-year-old woman still had left in her. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in decades, I wasn't thinking about what my family needed from me. I was thinking about what I needed for myself, and what I needed was to take back control of my own story before someone else wrote the ending. The first call I made was to my sister Helen, who lived 3 hours away in Columbus. At 78, she was still sharp as a tack and had always been the pragmatic one in our family. When I told her what I'd overheard, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Dorothy," she finally said, her voice tight with anger. "I've been waiting 20 years for you to see what the rest of us could see clear as day. That boy of yours has been bleeding you dry since Frank passed." Helen had never been one to mince words, and hearing her confirm what I'd been afraid to acknowledge hit me like a physical blow. She drove down that same afternoon, arriving with a briefcase full of documents and a determination that reminded me why she'd been so successful in her banking career. We spread everything out on my dining room table: bank statements, business records, loan documents, and property deeds. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 15 years, I'd given or loaned Michael over $300,000. The loans had never been repaid. The business shares I'd signed over to him for management purposes had been transferred into his name permanently. Even the deed to my house had been modified to include him as a co-owner, something I'd agreed 2 years ago when he'd convinced me it would help with estate planning. "Sweetheart," Helen said gently, "you don't own your own home anymore. You're living in Michael's house by his grace." That revelation sent me reeling. I'd thought I was being generous, helping my son build security for his family. Instead, I'd systematically dismantled my own financial independence, piece by piece, signature by signature. I was no longer a woman of means making choices about my money. I was a dependent living on the charity of people who were actively planning my demise. Helen spent the night, and we talked until dawn about what could be done. The business transfers might be irreversible, but there were other assets that were still solely mine: my savings accounts, my investment portfolio, and most importantly, my Social Security and pension benefits that Michael had been helping me manage for years. The next morning, Helen drove me to the bank. I walked up to the teller with my identification and asked to speak with the manager about my accounts. What I discovered made my stomach turn. Michael had been added as a joint account holder with full withdrawal privileges on every single account. He'd been treating my money as his own personal ATM for years, taking funds whenever he needed them and never bothering to ask permission. The bank manager, a kind woman named Jennifer, explained that while the arrangements were legal, they could be changed. "Mrs. Williams," she said carefully, "joint account holders have equal rights to the funds. If you want to maintain control over your own money, you'll need to open new accounts in your name only." That afternoon, I opened entirely new accounts at a different bank across town. I transferred every penny I could access, leaving the joint accounts with minimal balances. For the first time in 15 years, my money was actually mine again. Helen helped me set up automatic deposits for my Social Security and pension, ensuring that Michael would no longer have access to my monthly income. But the real awakening came when I called the hardware store to check on the business. I'd always assumed that despite transferring management to Michael, I still retained some ownership stake. The woman who answered the phone transferred me to the bookkeeper, who delivered the crushing news with bureaucratic efficiency. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Williams, but according to our records, you're not listed as an owner or partner in this business. Michael Williams is the sole proprietor. You might want to speak with him directly about any concerns." I hung up the phone with shaking hands. The business Frank and I had built from nothing, the hardware store that had supported our family for 40 years, was no longer mine in any legal sense. Michael had gradually maneuvered me out of my own company while convincing me he was doing me a favor by handling the paperwork. That evening, as Helen and I sat in my kitchen drinking tea, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I wasn't going to confront Michael yet. I wasn't going to demand explanations or plead for fairness. Instead, I was going to do something I hadn't done in decades. I was going to disappear. "I want to go away," I told Helen. "Somewhere they can't find me, somewhere they can't manipulate me. I need time to think clearly without their voices in my head telling me what I should do." Helen smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "Where do you want to go?" I thought about it for a moment, remembering a conversation I'd had with Frank years ago about places we'd visit when we retired. "Savannah," I said finally. "I've always wanted to see those beautiful old houses and walk through the historic squares." 2 days later, I was gone. I left a note on the kitchen counter that simply said, "Gone traveling. We'll be in touch when I'm ready." I turned off my cell phone, locked up the house, and climbed into Helen's car for the drive to the airport. Savannah was everything I'd imagined and more. I rented a charming apartment in the historic district, with tall windows overlooking a tree-lined square and enough space for me to spread out and think. For the first time in years, I wasn't cooking for anyone else, cleaning up after anyone else, or worrying about anyone else's problems. I spent my days walking through the historic district, touring beautiful old homes, and eating in restaurants where someone else did the cooking and cleaning. I bought books I actually wanted to read instead of the large print mysteries Michael always picked up for me. I purchased clothes that made me feel elegant rather than practical. I even bought a bottle of expensive perfume, something I hadn't done since Frank was alive. But the real revelation came in the quiet evenings in my rented apartment. Without the constant noise of other people's needs and expectations, I could finally hear my own thoughts clearly. I wasn't a doddering old woman grateful for her family's tolerance. I was a sharp, capable, financially independent person who had been systematically convinced that she was helpless. The phone calls started after 3 days, first from Michael, sounding irritated rather than concerned. Then from Patty, her voice tight with barely concealed panic. Then from Ashley and Tyler, both demanding to know where I was and when I was coming home. I let every call go to voicemail and listened to the messages with growing amazement. Not one of them expressed worry about my safety or well-being. They were all focused on one thing: when I would be back to resume my role as their personal ATM and household manager. Ashley was particularly direct. "Grandma, this is ridiculous. I have bills due and you know I depend on your help. Stop being dramatic and come home." Tyler's message was even more telling. "Grandma, I don't know what kind of midlife crisis this is, but you're really screwing up everyone's plans. Dad's freaking out about the business stuff, and Mom's having a meltdown. Just come home and we can all pretend this never happened." A midlife crisis, at 80 years old. The absurdity of it made me laugh out loud for the first time in months. After a week in Savannah, I felt strong enough to make some phone calls of my own. The first was to Robert Henderson, an old friend of Frank's who'd become a successful attorney. Bob and I had lost touch after Frank's funeral, but when I called his office, he took my call immediately. "Dorothy Williams," he said warmly. "I've been wondering how you were doing. What can I help you with?" I explained my situation as clearly as I could, from the overheard funeral planning to the financial manipulation I'd discovered. Bob listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of dismay or anger. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Dorothy," he said finally, "what Michael has done is legal but unconscionable. The good news is that you're not as helpless as he's led you to believe. The bad news is that undoing this mess is going to require some tough decisions." Bob agreed to fly down to Savannah to meet with me in person. 2 days later, we sat in a quiet cafe near my apartment while he laid out my options. Some of the financial transfers couldn't be reversed, but there were steps I could take to protect what remained of my assets and ensure my independence going forward. "The most important thing," Bob explained, "is to establish your mental competency clearly. Michael's been positioning himself as your caretaker, which gives him significant legal leverage. We need to demonstrate that you're fully capable of managing your own affairs." That afternoon, Bob arranged for me to undergo a comprehensive cognitive assessment with a geriatric psychiatrist. The doctor, a pleasant woman about my daughter-in-law's age, put me through a series of tests and interviews that confirmed what I already knew. My mind was as sharp as it had ever been. "Mrs. Williams," she said as she completed her evaluation, "you're functioning at a level typical of someone 20 years younger. There's absolutely no medical reason why you shouldn't be managing your own affairs." Armed with this documentation, Bob and I began the process of unwinding Michael's control over my life. We couldn't get back the business or the house, but we could ensure that my remaining assets were protected. More importantly, we could establish legal documentation that proved I was mentally competent and acting of my own free will. The most satisfying moment came when Bob helped me draft a new will. Instead of leaving everything to Michael, as my previous will had done, I divided my estate among several charities, with specific bequests to Helen and to Bob's grandchildren, whom I'd never met, but who represented the future rather than the past. "What about Michael and his family?" Bob asked gently. I thought about it for a long moment, remembering the conversation I'd overheard at my birthday party. "They can have the clearance chocolates and the drugstore gift cards," I said finally. "That seems appropriate, don't you think?" After 2 weeks in Savannah, I felt like a different person. The constant knot of anxiety in my stomach had disappeared. I was sleeping through the night for the first time in years. I'd gained weight from actually enjoying my meals instead of picking at leftovers after everyone else had eaten their fill. But I wasn't ready to go home yet. Home meant returning to the role of family doormat, and I'd discovered that I quite liked being Dorothy Williams, independent woman of means, instead of Grandma, the automatic yes person. I called Helen to let her know I was extending my trip. "I'm thinking about Maine next," I told her. "Maybe rent a cottage by the ocean for a few weeks." "Good for you," Helen said fiercely. "Stay as long as you want. Stay forever if it makes you happy. You've earned the right to please yourself for once." Meanwhile, back in Riverside, my disappearance was causing exactly the kind of chaos I should have expected. Michael had discovered the changes to my bank accounts when his automatic withdrawal for the store's insurance premium was declined. Patty had run up against the new restrictions when she tried to use what she thought was my credit card for her weekly shopping trip. The messages on my phone became increasingly frantic and, eventually, ugly. Michael accused me of having a mental breakdown and threatened to have me declared incompetent. Patty demanded to know what kind of selfish old woman abandons her family without warning. Ashley and Tyler both left messages that were so entitled and manipulative that I deleted them without listening to the end. But the message that really opened my eyes came from Ashley on my third week away. Her voice was shrill with panic. "Grandma, I don't know what game you're playing, but it needs to stop. Tyler and I are supposed to move into your house next month. And Dad says we can't until you come back and sign some papers. You're ruining everything. This isn't just about you. Move into my house, papers to sign." The picture became crystal clear. My disappearance hadn't just disrupted their access to my money. It had derailed their timeline for taking over my life completely. They'd been planning to move me out of my own home, probably into some sort of assisted living facility, while they took possession of the property I'd spent 40 years making into a home. That night, I sat on the porch of my rented cottage in Maine, watching the waves crash against the rocky shore, and I made a decision that would have shocked the woman I'd been just a month ago. I wasn't going back to Riverside. I wasn't going back to being their convenient resource to exploit and discard. I was going to build a new life, one where I was valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. And if my family thought they could manipulate or threaten me into returning to my old role, they were about to discover just how wrong they were. The next morning, I called Bob Henderson and asked him to proceed with the most drastic step we'd discussed, filing a restraining order against Michael. Not because I was afraid he'd hurt me physically, but because I needed legal protection from his financial manipulation and emotional abuse. "Are you sure about this, Dorothy?" Bob asked, gently. "Once we file this paperwork, there's no going back to the way things were." I looked out at the ocean, watching seagulls soar freely above the waves, and I smiled. "Bob," I said, "the way things were was killing me slowly. I'd rather live freely for whatever time I have left than die slowly while pretending everything is fine." That afternoon, I found a real estate agent in a charming coastal town an hour north of where I'd been staying. By evening, I'd put an offer on a small but elegant house with a view of the harbor. It wasn't as grand as the Victorian house I'd lost, but it was mine, completely and legally mine, with no co-owners or family complications. As I signed the purchase agreement, using my maiden name Dorothy Carter for the first time in 55 years, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced since I was a young woman. I was no longer Michael's mother, Ashley's grandmother, or Patty's convenient bank account. I was simply Dorothy, a woman starting over at 80 years old with enough money, enough time, and enough wisdom to finally live life on her own terms. The house in Maine came with a small garden, a cozy kitchen, and most importantly, neighbors who knew nothing about my history as a family doormat. To them, I was simply the friendly new resident who'd moved to town to enjoy her retirement. They had no expectations beyond ordinary politeness, and they certainly weren't planning my funeral while I baked their dinner. For the first time in decades, I was looking forward to tomorrow instead of dreading the next demand on my time, energy, or bank account. And if Michael and his family were waiting for me to come crawling back, begging for their forgiveness and acceptance, they were going to be waiting for a very long time indeed. The restraining order was served to Michael on a Tuesday morning while he was opening the hardware store. According to Bob Henderson, who received the call from the sheriff's office, Michael's reaction was exactly what I'd expected: rage, denial, and immediate threats of legal retaliation. He spent the rest of the day calling every number he could, find, trying to locate me and demand an explanation. What he didn't expect was that I'd already anticipated his next moves. Working with Bob, I'd filed preemptive documentation with the local court establishing my mental competency and financial independence. Every bank in Riverside had been notified that Michael Williams no longer had any authority over my accounts or affairs. I'd even registered with the post office to have all mail forwarded to my attorney's office, ensuring that Michael couldn't intercept anything important. The beauty of being 80 years old, I discovered, was that people underestimate your capacity for strategic thinking. Michael had spent years conditioning me to be passive and dependent, but he'd forgotten that I'd once been sharp enough to help build a successful business from scratch. That intelligence hadn't disappeared. It had just been buried under decades of being told I was too old, too fragile, too out of touch to handle important matters. From my new home in Pemaquid Point, Maine, I watched the fallout unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Bob kept me informed of the legal developments, while Helen provided updates on the family drama that was consuming Riverside's small-town gossip network. Michael's first strategy was predictable. He tried to paint me as a confused elderly woman who'd been manipulated by unscrupulous outsiders. He filed a petition with the county court claiming that I was suffering from dementia and requesting guardianship over my person and estate. The petition was thorough and well-crafted, citing my sudden behavioral changes and irrational decision-making as evidence of cognitive decline. Unfortunately for Michael, I'd spent weeks building an ironclad case for my mental competency. The psychiatric evaluation from Savannah was just the beginning. Bob had arranged for additional assessments from 2 independent physicians, both of whom confirmed that I was functioning at a superior cognitive level for my age. More damaging to Michael's case, we had documentation of every financial transaction he'd made using my accounts over the past 5 years, creating a clear pattern of exploitation that undermined his claims of acting in my best interests. The hearing was held on a gray October morning in the Riverside courthouse where Frank and I had gotten our marriage license 55 years earlier. I flew back to Ohio specifically for the proceeding, staying in a hotel rather than risking any contact with Michael or his family. Bob had warned me that seeing them in person might be emotionally difficult, but I was unprepared for the shock of Michael's appearance. He looked terrible. The confident, entitled man who'd been managing my life for years appeared haggard and desperate. His hair was unkempt, his suit was wrinkled, and he had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. Patty sat beside him, her usually perfect appearance showing similar signs of stress. Ashley and Tyler flanked them, both looking sullen and uncomfortable in their formal clothes. When I walked into the courtroom with Bob, the silence was deafening. Michael's mouth fell open, and Patty actually gasped out loud. They'd clearly expected me to appear frail and confused, supporting their narrative of an elderly woman in decline. Instead, I was wearing a beautifully tailored navy suit I'd bought in Portland, my hair professionally styled, and my makeup perfectly applied. I looked like exactly what I was, a competent, well-dressed woman in complete control of her faculties. The judge, a middle-aged woman named Patricia Thornton, reviewed the documentation with obvious care. She examined my medical evaluations, my cognitive assessments, and the financial records that demonstrated my ability to manage complex transactions independently. Then she looked at Michael's petition and the evidence he'd submitted to support his claims. "Mr. Williams," Judge Thornton said finally, "your petition states that your mother is incapable of managing her affairs due to cognitive decline. However, the evidence presented suggests that she has been managing them quite effectively, while you have been managing them quite poorly. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Michael's attorney, a nervous young man who clearly wished he were anywhere else, attempted to argue that my recent actions were evidence of impaired judgment. Moving away from family, changing banks, hiring new legal counsel. All of this, he claimed, demonstrated that I was no longer thinking clearly. Judge Thornton was not impressed. "Counselor," she said dryly, "changing one's living situation, managing one's finances independently, and seeking legal advice are all signs of competent decision-making. If every adult who moved to a new state and hired an attorney could be declared incompetent, we'd have a very different legal system." The turning point came when Bob presented our evidence of Michael's financial exploitation. Bank records showed systematic withdrawals from my accounts without my knowledge or consent. Business documents revealed that my ownership stake in the psychiatric hardware store had been transferred to Michael through a series of contracts that I'd been pressured to sign under false pretenses. Most damning of all, we had documentation showing that Michael had been telling creditors and business partners that I was mentally incompetent while simultaneously using my credit and assets to secure loans and investments. "Your Honor," Bobby said, his voice steady and professional. "Mr. Williams cannot simultaneously claim that his mother is incompetent while using her competency to benefit financially. Either she was capable of making the business decisions he relied upon, or she wasn't. He can't have it both ways." The judge took a recess to review all the evidence, and I spent 20 minutes in the courthouse hallway avoiding eye contact with my family. Michael approached me once, his face red with anger, but Bob intervened before he could speak. "Your client is under a restraining order," Bob reminded Michael's attorney. "Any contact with my client constitutes a violation." When Judge Thornton returned, her decision was swift and unequivocal. "The petition for guardianship is denied," she announced. "Mrs. Williams has demonstrated clear mental competency and the ability to manage her affairs independently. Furthermore, this court finds that the petitioner's own actions raise serious questions about his motives and trustworthiness. Mrs. Williams, you are free to continue managing your life as you see fit." Michael's face went white, then purple. Patty began crying loudly, not the gentle tears of disappointment, but the harsh sobs of someone whose financial security had just evaporated. Ashley and Tyler looked stunned, as if they couldn't comprehend that their carefully laid plans had just crumbled to dust. As I left the courthouse with Bob, I heard Michael shouting behind us, "This isn't over, Mother. You can't just throw away 50 years of family. We'll fight this. We'll prove you're not thinking clearly." I turned around once, looking at the man I'd raised and supported and sacrificed for, and I felt nothing but pity. "Michael," I said quietly, "the only thing I'm thinking clearly about is that I should have done this years ago." That evening, I flew back to Maine with a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The legal battle was over, but more importantly, the emotional battle was over too. I was no longer fighting for my family's love and acceptance. I was no longer trying to prove my worth through endless giving and sacrifice. I was simply living my life, and it felt remarkably peaceful. My new home in Pemaquid Point was everything I'd hoped for and more. The house was small but elegant, with large windows that overlooked the rocky coastline, and a garden that was manageable for someone my age. My neighbors were friendly, but not intrusive, offering help when needed, but respecting my independence. I joined the local library's volunteer program, helping with their literacy initiative for adults. It was rewarding work that used my skills and experience while connecting me with people who appreciated my contributions. The library director, Linda Thompson, was a woman about Ashley's age who treated me like a valuable colleague rather than a charity case. "Dorothy," Linda told me after I'd been volunteering for a month, "you're exactly what our program needed. You have patience, wisdom, and the kind of life experience that our students can really relate to." I also joined a pottery class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but had never had time for when I was busy managing everyone else's lives. My instructor, Grace Murphy, was a 75-year-old former art teacher who'd moved to Maine after her retirement. She became my first real friend in years, someone who knew me as Dorothy the pottery student, rather than Dorothy the family bank account. Grace and I would often sit on my porch after class, drinking tea and watching the sunset over the water. She'd lived through her own family drama years earlier when her children had tried to pressure her into selling her home and moving in with one of them. "The hardest part," Grace told me one evening, "wasn't saying no to them. It was accepting that they saw me as a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved. Once I made peace with that reality, everything else became much clearer." Grace's words resonated deeply with me. I'd spent so many years trying to earn love through usefulness that I'd forgotten love shouldn't require payment. Real love is freely given, not purchased through sacrifice and service. As winter approached, I settled into a routine that was entirely my own. I woke up when I wanted to, ate what I wanted to eat, and spent my days pursuing activities that brought me genuine joy. I read novels instead of large print mysteries. I watched foreign films instead of family-friendly movies. I bought expensive coffee and good wine and beautiful flowers for no reason other than they made me happy. The silence from Riverside was initially welcome, but as weeks turned to months, I began to receive occasional updates through Helen. The family was struggling without their reliable source of emergency funds. Ashley had been forced to move back, in with her parents when she couldn't afford her own place. Tyler had lost his car when he couldn't make the payments, and I wasn't there to bail him out. Michael and Patty had taken out a second mortgage on their house to cover business expenses they'd previously handled with my money. More significantly, the hardware store was struggling. Without access to my assets as a financial cushion, Michael was discovering just how thin the profit margins actually were. He'd been using my money to mask poor business decisions for years, and now those decisions were catching up with him. Helen also told me about the social fallout in Riverside. Word had spread about the court hearing and the restraining order, and public opinion was largely on my side. People who'd known Frank and me for decades were shocked to learn how Michael had been treating me. Several longtime customers had stopped shopping at the hardware store, saying they couldn't support a business run by someone who would exploit his own mother. "The whole town is talking about it," Helen reported during one of our weekly phone calls. "Most people are saying it's about time you stood up for yourself. There are a few who think children should automatically inherit everything, but they're definitely in the minority." The validation felt good, but it also highlighted how isolated I'd become in my old life. I'd been so focused on keeping the peace within my family that I'd lost touch with the broader community that might have supported me if I'd been brave enough to ask for help. Christmas approached with none of the anxiety I'd felt in previous years. Instead of spending weeks cooking and shopping and decorating for people who barely acknowledged my efforts, I planned a quiet celebration for myself. I bought a small tree and decorated it with ornaments I actually liked, rather than the sentimental pieces that held memories of disappointment and obligation. On Christmas Eve, Grace invited me to join her family's celebration. Her children and grandchildren welcomed me warmly, including me in their traditions and treating me like an honored guest rather than an unpaid servant. It was the first Christmas in decades where I felt genuinely appreciated and valued. As I sat around Grace's fireplace, listening to her grandchildren play piano and watching her daughter help with dinner cleanup, I realized this was what family was supposed to feel like. Mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and genuine affection that didn't depend on financial transactions or one-sided sacrifice. "You look happy," Grace's son Tom said to me as we stood on the deck watching snow fall over the harbor. "Really, genuinely happy. It's nice to see." I thought about his words as I walked home that evening, my feet crunching through fresh snow, under a sky full of stars. I was happy, probably for the first time in 20 years. I was living in a place I loved, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. I had enough money to live comfortably, enough health to enjoy my independence, and enough time left to make my remaining years count. The old Dorothy would have felt guilty about that happiness, would have worried that she was being selfish by choosing her own well-being over her family's comfort. But the new Dorothy, the one who'd been born in that courthouse in Riverside, understood that there's nothing selfish about refusing to be exploited. There's nothing wrong with expecting to be treated with basic respect and dignity, even by family members who think they're entitled to your resources. As the new year began, I made a resolution that would have shocked my old self. I promised to continue putting my own needs first. Not in a cruel or vindictive way, but in the healthy, balanced way that well-adjusted people live their lives. I would be generous when I chose to be generous, not when I was pressured or manipulated into giving. I would help people who appreciated my help, not people who saw it as their due. Most importantly, I would never again confuse being useful with being loved. Those were two entirely different things, and understanding the distinction had quite literally saved my life. Winter in Maine was harsh but beautiful, and I found peace in the rhythm of storms and clear days, snow and sunshine. My cottage was warm and cozy, my bank account was stable, and my days were filled with activities that brought me genuine satisfaction. For the first time in decades, I was living for myself rather than existing for others. The woman who'd discovered her family planning her funeral had died that night in Riverside. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more content with the life she'd chosen to build. Spring arrived in Maine with a burst of color that took my breath away. After months of stark winter beauty, the sudden explosion of wildflowers and budding trees felt like a celebration of new beginnings. I was tending to my small garden when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Grandma?" The voice was shaky, uncertain. It took me a moment to realize it was Tyler. "How did you get this number?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "I hired a private investigator," he admitted. "Grandma, we need to talk. Everything's falling apart here, and Dad says it's all your fault. But I think maybe we messed up." I sat down on my garden bench, studying the purple lupines I'd planted the week before. "What do you want, Tyler?" "Dad lost the store," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The bank foreclosed last month. He couldn't make the payments without your help. And Ashley's been calling you a selfish old witch to anyone who'll listen. But people are starting to turn against us. Mrs. Peterson at the grocery store actually told Ashley she deserved better grandparents, right to her face." I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but it faded quickly. "I'm sorry to hear about your father's business troubles," I said, "but I fail to see how that's my responsibility." "That's just it," Tyler said desperately. "I've been thinking about that night, your birthday, and I remembered some things. Like how Ashley and I were talking about your stuff like you were already dead, and how Dad was always complaining about how much money you cost him. But then, he'd use your credit cards for everything. I never really thought about it before, but now? Now you're facing consequences," I finished. "And you want me to make them go away." "No," Tyler's voice cracked. "I mean, yes, everything sucks, but that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because I finally figured out that we treated you horribly, and I want to apologize. Really apologize, not just because I want something." I was quiet for a long moment, watching a family of ducks paddle across the small pond visible from my garden. "Tyler," I said finally, "I appreciate the apology. I really do. But an apology doesn't undo 20 years of being treated like an ATM with arms." "I know," he said quietly. I wanted you to know that I know we were wrong, all of us, and I'm sorry." After I hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, processing the conversation. Tyler's call was the first acknowledgement from any family member that they'd treated me poorly. It felt like a small victory, but also a reminder of how low the bar had been set for basic human decency in my old life. 2 weeks later, Helen called with news that was both satisfying and sad. Michael had filed for bankruptcy, unable to manage the debt he'd accumulated while using my assets as collateral. The hardware store had been sold to a regional chain, ending 40 years of family ownership. Patty had taken a job at a department store, her first employment in over 20 years. Ashley was working as a server at a chain restaurant, finally learning what it meant to earn her own money. The whole family's having to face reality for the first time, Helen told me, and they don't like it much. Patty's been telling anyone who'll listen that you've ruined their lives by being vindictive and selfish. I found myself laughing at the irony. So I'm vindictive for refusing to continue funding their lifestyle. But they weren't vindictive when they planned my funeral at my birthday party. Small-town gossip doesn't always follow logic, Helen replied dryly. But most people see through Patty's complaints. The general consensus is that you've been more than generous over the years, and it's about time you looked after yourself. The conversation reminded me of something Grace had said weeks earlier about the difference between consequences and revenge. I wasn't punishing my family by living independently. I was simply no longer shielding them from the natural results of their choices. Without my money to cushion their mistakes and poor decisions, they were finally experiencing the real world that most people navigate every day. Summer brought a stream of visitors to coastal Maine, and my little town came alive with tourists and seasonal residents. I found myself busier than I'd been in years, but it was the good kind of busy that comes from choosing your own activities, rather than having obligations thrust upon you. I'd joined the Historical Society and was helping to organize a summer lecture series about Maine's maritime history. The work was intellectually stimulating and gave me a chance to use research skills I'd forgotten I possessed. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a retired history professor who'd moved to town the same time I had, became both a colleague and a friend. Dorothy. She told me after one particularly successful lecture, "You have a real gift for this kind of work. Have you ever considered writing? Your presentation on the fishing industry was better than anything I heard in 30 years of academic conferences." The suggestion intrigued me more than I'd expected. I'd always enjoyed writing letters and keeping journals, but I'd never thought of myself as someone capable of serious writing. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and started writing about my experience leaving Riverside. Not for publication, just for myself. But the words flowed in a way that surprised me. Writing became my new passion project. Every morning, I'd sit by my living room window with my laptop, watching the harbor wake up while I worked on what was becoming a memoir of sorts. Not just the story of my escape from family exploitation, but a broader reflection on women's relationships with money, power, and self-worth in later life. It was during one of these writing sessions that I received a call that changed everything. The voice was professional, unfamiliar, and carried an Ohio area code. "Mrs. Williams, this is Detective Sarah Martinez with the Riverside Police Department. I'm calling about a complaint that's been filed against you by your son, Michael Williams." My blood ran cold. "What kind of complaint?" "Mr. Williams is alleging that you've stolen money from him and his family. He claims that you took funds that legally belong to him and transferred them to accounts he can't access. He's requesting that we investigate this as a case of elder financial abuse." The irony was so thick I could barely speak. "Detective Martinez," I said carefully, "I think there may be some confusion about who's been financially abusing whom in this situation." That's what I'm hoping to sort out," she replied. "Would you be willing to come in for an interview? Or, if travel is difficult, I could arrange to speak with you by video conference." I assured her that I'd be happy to cooperate fully with any investigation, and we scheduled a video call for the following week. As soon as I hung up, I called Bob Henderson. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Bob said when I explained the situation. "Michael's desperate, and desperate people make dangerous accusations. The good news is that we have documentation for everything. The bad news is that this could get messy before it gets resolved." Bob helped me prepare for the interview with Detective Martinez, organizing bank records, legal documents, and medical evaluations that would demonstrate not only my mental competency, but also the pattern of financial exploitation I'd endured. We also gathered evidence of Michael's mismanagement of both my assets and his own business affairs. The video conference with Detective Martinez was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I dressed professionally, set up my laptop in my brightest room, and made sure I had all relevant documents within easy reach. Grace sat with me for moral support, just outside the camera's view. Detective Martinez was a middle-aged Latina woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She began the interview by asking me to explain my relationship with Michael and the financial arrangements we'd had over the years. I told her everything, starting with Frank's death and my decision to help Michael with the business. Continuing, through years of gradually escalating financial requests, and ending with my discovery of how completely I'd been manipulated. I provided specific examples, dates, and amounts, referencing the documentation Bob had helped me organize. "Mrs. Williams," Detective Martinez said when I finished, "this doesn't sound like a case of elder financial abuse by you. It sounds like a case of elder financial abuse against you. Can you walk me through exactly what money Mr. Williams claims you stole?" I explained how I'd transferred my own money from joint accounts to individual accounts when I discovered Michael had been treating my funds as his personal piggy bank. I showed her the documentation proving that the money had originated from my Social Security, pension, and investment accounts, not from any source that could legitimately be considered Michael's property. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Detective Martinez said. "Your son is claiming that you stole money that was originally yours from accounts that bore your name after discovering that he'd been making unauthorized withdrawals for years." "That's correct," I confirmed. "He's also claiming that I'm mentally incompetent, despite the fact that a judge ruled otherwise after reviewing comprehensive medical and psychiatric evaluations." Detective Martinez asked to see those evaluations, along with the court documents from the guardianship hearing. As she reviewed the paperwork, her expression grew increasingly skeptical. "Mrs. Williams," she said finally, "based on what I'm seeing here, it appears that you've been the victim of financial exploitation, not the perpetrator. I'm going to need to speak with your son, but I suspect this complaint is going to be dismissed fairly quickly." The relief I felt was overwhelming. For weeks, I'd been worried that Michael might somehow succeed in portraying me as a confused old woman who'd stolen from her own family. Instead, his desperation had backfired spectacularly, drawing official attention to his own questionable behavior. 2 days later, Detective Martinez called with an update. "I interviewed your son yesterday," she said. "His story fell apart pretty quickly when I started asking for specifics. He couldn't explain why money that came from your accounts should be considered his property, and he became increasingly agitated when I asked about his withdrawal history from those accounts." She paused, then continued with what sounded like satisfaction in her voice. "Mrs. Williams, not only am I dismissing his complaint against you, but I'm opening an investigation into possible financial elder abuse with you as the victim. Your son may find himself facing charges if we determine that his actions meet the legal definition of exploitation." The irony was perfect. In his desperation to regain control over my finances, Michael had triggered an investigation that might result in criminal charges against himself. It was justice in a way I never could have imagined. That evening, I called Helen to share the news. She laughed so hard I worried she might hurt herself. "Oh, Dorothy," she gasped between giggles. "That boy always was too clever for his own good. Frank would have gotten such a kick out of this. His son trying to have his own mother arrested for protecting her own money." As summer progressed, the investigation into Michael's financial behavior expanded. Detective Martinez discovered that he'd been using my credit and assets to secure business loans without my knowledge, a practice that bordered on identity theft. She also found evidence that he'd been intercepting my mail to hide financial statements that would have revealed his unauthorized transactions. The district attorney's office became involved, and Michael was eventually charged with 3 counts of financial exploitation of an elderly person. The charges carried potential jail time and substantial fines, consequences that seemed to finally wake Michael up to the seriousness of what he'd done. Through Bob Henderson, Michael's attorney reached out to discuss a plea agreement. Michael was willing to admit wrongdoing and accept responsibility for his actions in exchange for probation rather than jail time. He was also prepared to sign a permanent agreement barring him from any involvement in my financial affairs and acknowledging my right to live independently without interference. "What do you think?" Bob asked when he presented the offer. "It would give you legal protection and formal acknowledgement that you were the victim here, not the perpetrator." I thought about it for several days, weighing the satisfaction of seeing Michael face serious consequences against the practical benefits of a negotiated resolution. In the end, I decided that formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing was more important than punishment. "I want him to admit publicly what he did," I told Bob. "Not just in a legal document, but in a way that the community can see. He spent years telling people I was incompetent and dependent. I want him to acknowledge that he was the one who was behaving improperly." The plea hearing was held on a crisp October morning, with local media present because financial elder abuse cases were becoming increasingly common in Ohio. Michael stood before Judge Thornton, the same judge who'd dismissed his guardianship petition and formally admitted to exploiting my finances over a period of 15 years. "Your Honor," he said, reading from a prepared statement, "I took advantage of my mother's generosity and trust. I misrepresented her financial situation to serve my own interests, and I attempted to control her life and assets in ways that were both unethical and illegal. I acknowledge that my actions caused her significant emotional and financial harm." Judge Thornton sentenced Michael to 3 years of probation, substantial fines, and community service focused on elder advocacy. She also issued a permanent restraining order preventing him from contacting me without my explicit consent. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a sense of closure that had been missing from my new life in Maine. The legal vindication was satisfying, but more important was the public acknowledgement that I'd been wronged, not wrong. For years, I'd been gaslit into believing that my desire for independence and respect was unreasonable. Now, a court of law had confirmed what I'd finally learned to believe. I deserved better treatment than I'd been receiving. The news coverage of the plea hearing reached Maine, and I found myself fielding calls from friends and neighbors who'd seen the story online. Instead of sympathy, most offered congratulations on my courage in standing up for myself. "Dorothy," Grace said when she called after seeing the news, "you've become something of a local hero. People are talking about your story as an example of how it's never too late to reclaim your life." That phone call gave me an idea that would shape the next chapter of my journey. If my story could inspire other people to examine their own relationships and stand up for their own dignity, maybe there was a larger purpose to everything I'd been through. I decided it was time to finish writing my memoir, not just as a personal exercise, but as something that might help other people recognize and escape their own situations of exploitation and manipulation. The woman who'd discovered her family, planning her funeral, had found her voice, and she was ready to use it. Publishing my memoir turned out to be easier than I'd expected, thanks to a connection Elizabeth Warren made through her academic network. A small but respected press that specialized in women's stories agreed to publish The Price of Peace, A Daughter's Journey from Doormat to Independence, after reading just 3 chapters. The editor, Margaret Chen, was a woman about Ashley's age who understood immediately what I was trying to accomplish. "Dorothy," she told me during our first phone conference, "this isn't just your story. This is the story of thousands of women who've confused self-sacrifice with love, who've been conditioned to believe that their worth depends on their usefulness to others." Working with Margaret was invigorating in a way I hadn't anticipated. She challenged me to dig deeper into the psychological aspects of my experience, to examine not just what had happened, but why I'd allowed it to happen for so long. The process was sometimes painful, forcing me to confront my own role in enabling the very behavior that had nearly destroyed my sense of self-worth. "The hardest chapter for me to write," I told Grace one afternoon as we worked in my garden, "was the one about Frank. I had to face the fact that some of the patterns started with him, that his well-meaning protectiveness actually laid the groundwork for Michael's manipulation. Grace nodded thoughtfully. It's difficult to acknowledge that someone we loved contributed to our problems, even unintentionally. But that's what makes your story so powerful. You're not painting yourself as a perfect victim or your family as cartoon villains. You're showing how these patterns develop gradually, how they can seem normal even when they're destructive. The book was scheduled for publication in the spring, which gave me time to prepare for what Margaret warned would be significant media attention. Stories like yours resonate with a lot of people, she explained. Be prepared for interviews, speaking requests, and probably some pushback from people who think adult children are automatically entitled to their parents' resources. Meanwhile, life in Pemaquid Point had settled into a rhythm that brought me more satisfaction than I'd thought possible at my age. My volunteer work at the library had expanded to include a weekly support group for older adults dealing with family, financial exploitation. Word had spread about my experience, and I found myself counseling people who were struggling with situations remarkably similar to what I'd endured. One woman, Ruth Campbell, reminded me powerfully of my former self. At 75, she was supporting 3 adult children and 7 grandchildren, draining her retirement savings to fund their various crises and emergencies. She came to my support group after her daughter had demanded that Ruth sell her house to pay for her grandson's wedding. I don't know what to do, Ruth said during her first meeting with the group. I want to help my family, but I'm starting to worry about my own future. What if I run out of money? What if I need care and can't afford it because I've given everything away? Listening to Ruth, I could hear my own voice from 3 years ago, full of guilt and confusion, torn between self-preservation and the desperate need to be needed. The other group members and I spent weeks helping Ruth see that wanting financial security wasn't selfish, that she couldn't take care of anyone else if she didn't first take care of herself. The breakthrough came when Ruth's daughter called, during one of our meetings, demanding to know why her mother was being so unreasonable about the wedding expenses. I watched Ruth's face transform as she listened to her daughter's entitled demands, finally hearing what the rest of us had been seeing all along. Sarah, Ruth said quietly into the phone, I raised you to stand on your own feet, not to lean on your mother's checkbook. If you can't afford the wedding you want, have the wedding you can afford. I'm not selling my house to fund your party. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening, followed by the kind of tantrum I remembered well from my own experience. Ruth listened calmly, then said something that made me proud to know her. Sarah, you're 43 years old. It's time you learned the difference between what you want and what you need. I love you, but I'm not your personal bank. Watching Ruth reclaim her power reminded me of my own journey and reinforced my decision to share my story more widely. If my experience could help even one person avoid 20 years of financial and emotional exploitation, the vulnerability of publication would be worth it. As winter melted into spring, advance copies of my book began circulating, and the early responses were overwhelming. Margaret had been right about the media attention. Within weeks of the book's official release, I was fielding requests for interviews from newspapers, magazines, and television shows across the country. The first major interview was with a national morning show, conducted via video link from my living room. The host, a woman named Jennifer Martinez, had clearly done her homework and asked thoughtful questions about the broader implications of my story. Dorothy, she said toward the end of our conversation, what would you say to other women who recognize themselves in your story but feel trapped by family obligations and guilt? I looked directly into the camera, thinking about Ruth, about the members of my support group, about all the women I'd never meet who might be watching. I'd tell them that love shouldn't require you to bankrupt yourself, emotionally or financially. Real love celebrates your independence and supports your well-being. If someone in your life is making you feel guilty for having boundaries, for wanting to control your own resources, for expecting basic respect, then you're not dealing with love. You're dealing with manipulation." The interview generated more response than I'd expected. My publisher forwarded hundreds of emails from women sharing their own stories of family exploitation, thanking me for giving them permission to put themselves first. Many were in situations far worse than mine had been, supporting multiple generations while being treated as less important than the family pets. One letter particularly moved me, from a woman named Sandra in Arizona who'd been funding her son's drug addiction for 15 years under the guise of helping with rent and groceries. After reading my book, she'd finally admitted him to rehab and cut off his access to her bank accounts. "I realized," Sandra wrote, "that I wasn't helping him get better. I was enabling him to stay sick while I destroyed my own financial security. Your story gave me the courage to love him enough to say no." The speaking engagements that followed were both exhausting and energizing. I found myself traveling to senior centers, community groups, and financial planning seminars, sharing my story and watching recognition dawn on faces in the audience. Often, women would approach me afterward with their own stories of exploitation, asking for advice on how to break free from patterns that had defined their relationships for decades. In Phoenix, I met a woman whose daughter had been forging her signature on checks for months. In Seattle, I talked with a grandmother who'd been convinced by her family that paying for everyone's cell phones and car insurance was her duty as the matriarch. In Detroit, I counseled a widow whose sons had moved back in with her temporarily 7 years ago and were now fighting over who would inherit her house while she was still living in it. Each conversation reinforced my belief that my story wasn't unique, that families across the country were struggling with the same dynamics that had nearly destroyed my sense of self-worth. The difference was that most people were still trapped in those patterns, still believing that endless giving was the price of being loved. During a book signing in Portland, a woman about Michael's age approached my table with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Williams," she said, "I think I might be your son. Not literally, but I've been treating my mother the way your son treated you, and reading your book made me realize how awful that must feel." The conversation that followed was one of the most meaningful of my entire book tour. This woman, Jennifer, had been gradually taking over her mother's finances under the guise of helping, making decisions about her mother's money and living situation without really consulting her. She'd never thought of it as exploitation, because her motives seemed good, but my book had helped her see the situation from her mother's perspective. "I need to give her back control," Jennifer said. "I need to apologize for treating her like she was incompetent just because she's 85. She raised 6 children and ran a successful business. Why did I think she suddenly couldn't manage a checkbook?" 6 months after publication, my book had become something I never expected. A minor bestseller in the self-help and memoir categories. More importantly, it had sparked conversations about elder financial abuse and family dynamics that were long overdue. I was invited to speak at conferences for social workers, elder law attorneys, and financial planners, helping professionals recognize the warning signs of family exploitation. The success of the book also brought an unexpected development, renewed contact from my family in Ohio. Tyler had written me a long letter, not asking for anything but sharing how much my story had affected him. He'd started therapy to work through his own relationship patterns and was trying to rebuild his life based on his own efforts rather than family resources. "I showed your book to my therapist," Tyler wrote, "and she helped me understand that the way we treated you wasn't just mean. It was abusive. I'm ashamed of the person I was, but I'm working to become someone you might be proud to know someday." Even more surprising was a brief email from Ashley, acknowledging that she'd read the book and was thinking about things differently now. It wasn't an apology, exactly, but it was the closest thing to self-reflection I'd ever seen from her. Michael, predictably, had reacted with anger and denial. According to Helen, he'd been telling anyone who would listen that my book was full of lies and exaggerations, that I was a vindictive old woman trying to profit from family drama. But his credibility in Riverside had been damaged by the criminal charges, and most people seemed to view his complaints as further evidence of the character flaws that had gotten him into trouble in the first place. As my second winter in Maine approached, I realized that I'd built something I'd never had before, a life that was entirely mine. My days were filled with activities I'd chosen, people I genuinely enjoyed, and work that felt meaningful. I had enough money to live comfortably without worrying about every expense, and I was surrounded by people who valued my contributions without taking them for granted. The contrast with my old life was stark. 3 years ago, I'd been cooking elaborate meals for people who barely thanked me, cleaning up after adults who'd never learned to take care of themselves, and funding lifestyles for people who saw me as an obstacle to their inheritance. Now I was cooking simple meals I actually enjoyed, maintaining a home that reflected my own tastes, and spending my money on experiences and causes that brought me satisfaction. But perhaps the most significant change was internal. I'd stopped measuring my worth by my usefulness to others. I no longer felt guilty for having preferences, for setting boundaries, for expecting basic respect from the people in my life. I'd learned the difference between being needed and being valued, between being loved and being exploited. On my 83rd birthday, I celebrated with Grace and Elizabeth and several other friends I'd made in Maine. We had dinner at a small restaurant overlooking the harbor, where I was treated like an honored guest rather than an unpaid servant. The conversation was lively and included me as a full participant, rather than just an audience for other people's problems. As I blew out the candles on a cake someone else had bought and decorated, I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, standing in her kitchen listening to her family plan her funeral. That woman had been convinced that her value lay in what she could provide to others, that love was something she had to earn through constant sacrifice. The woman celebrating her 83rd birthday in Maine knew better. She'd learned that real love doesn't require payment, that respect isn't something you have to purchase with your bank account, and that it's never too late to choose dignity over convenience. The most beautiful part of my new life wasn't the coastal views or the financial security or even the recognition that came with the book's success. It was the simple peace that came from living authentically, making decisions based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. I'd spent most of my adult life asking, what do they need from me? Now I spent my days asking, what do I need for myself? The shift in perspective had changed everything, and at 83, I was finally living the life I'd always deserved, but had never dared to claim. As the evening wound down and my friends headed home, I stood on my porch watching the lighthouse beams sweep across the dark water. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new choices, and new opportunities to live on my own terms. The woman who'd been planning my funeral could never have imagined the life I'd built from the ashes of their expectations. I went inside, made myself a cup of tea, and settled into my favorite chair with the novel I'd been reading. For the first time in decades, I had nowhere else to be, no one else to serve, and nothing to prove to anyone. I was simply Dorothy Williams, living exactly the life she'd chosen for herself. It was, I realized, the perfect ending to a story that had really been a beginning all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.